Hello and welcome back to this lecture series in Python programming. So today we are going to be looking at the data type that is numbers, right? So numbers consist of two main data types, that is integer and float. So in this video we'll be looking at how to define them into variables, how to perform mathematical operations with them, and what is the difference between integer and float, and when to use integer and when to use float. So without further ado, let's jump into the video. Yes, so to understand the proper difference between integer and float, we need to start programming using those data types, right? So first I will define two variables. So I will define a variable A, which says, let us say 5, right? And I have my variable B that says 7, right? And I have my variable C. Now this will be a float variable. So integer is just a normal number that you already have an idea of what an integer is mathematically. So a float data type is nothing but an integer but with a decimal point, right? So my C would be 5.0, right? Now my D would be 7.0. Okay, so these are four variables that I've defined. The first two are integer and the second two are float. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this, and I'm going to find out the type of these variables, right? So there is a function in Python called the type. So if you inside print, if you give type of and give a variable name inside, it will give me the type of data type of that particular variable, and I want to print it, of course, so I'm putting it inside the print function, right? So I'm saving it and I'm running. As you can see below, that the output that we have got is class of int, right? So A and B are integers and class int is the data type for integer. And if I give C, I should be getting float. So I will run this again. As you can see, once I run this program, so I'm able to see the output here as class float, right? So let me save this program. Right, so the next thing that we'll be doing is performing operations on integers and float separately. So what we'll do is, first we'll have a variable called integer sum, right? So integer sum would be a plus b. So I want to add these, and let me print in the next line. Let me print the answer, and I go to the output, and I will save this and I will run this file. So now you can get the answer as 12, right? So what is 12 exactly here? 12 is an integer variable. So just to confirm that, I will type the type of function here, and we will see what happens. Right. So yeah, so I'm having a class float because I still have the print type C here. So I will comment that out and I'll run it again. Yes, so we have the class int. So what happens is, if I add two integer variables, and if I store it in another variable, that variable is obviously an integer. So if you add two integers, you will get an integer, right? So let us see what happens if we add to float. So C plus D, and I'll change the variable name to float sum, and I will display the float sums. Yeah, we already know what the answer is. So the answer would be float sum. Our answer should be 12, right? So if it is float, it should be 12.0, right? So that is what we're expecting. And I will run this. I will save it. Yeah. So we're having the answer as 12.0 and the class is float. So what we've understood right now is, if you add two integers and if you add two float, the answer is going to be integer and float respectively, right? So now we need to understand as to what happens if we combine two different data types, that is int and float, especially when you're adding them, right? So let us say a variable called combined sum is equal to, right? So I will add a and I will add c. So a plus c should give me 5 plus 5.0. Now we need to understand what the resultant data type would be, right? So that is something that is very important. Now whether it will be an integer or whether it will be a float, so we don't know. So we'll see what happens, right? So to see that, we need the type of combined sum, and I will run it, and I will comment this out. Oh, I haven't saved it yet. Now I will run it. And yes, so this is the last one. And yeah, I haven't printed it. So I will put it inside the print. No issues. We should be getting the answer now. And yes, the class is now float. Now, what exactly happens here is something in programming that we call it as type conversion, right? So when we have an integer variable and a float variable, to account for the missing float values, for example, if I have something like 5.5 or something, and if I add it, obviously the answer is going to be 10.5, right? So a is basically 5.0. According to humans, this 5 and 5.0 is the same thing, but according to a computer, they are something fundamentally different, right? So just to the data type has been programmed in such a way that we are not supposed to miss any values that are there inside the decimal. So what happens here is this a and c, when it combines, this a gets converted to float and the whole answer is there in float, because then if we convert this c into integer, alternatively we would lose all the values after this decimal place, right? So to make sure that doesn't happen, this type conversion is taking place. Yes, so we have seen everything about addition, and this logic applies to almost all the other kinds of operations as well. In subtraction, this is the same case, but in division, there's something that we need to know, right? So we'll first perform all the operations. So we'll have multiplication is equal to a into c, right? And I will print it, and I will have division is equal to a divided by c, right? And I'll print it. Yeah, I will save this now, and I will run it. Now we have three different outputs here. So the float is just coming from here, so let's ignore that. And 25.0 and 1.0. Now as you can see, once I combine an integer and a float variable to perform an operation, the answer is always a float variable, right? But there is something called an integer division in division. So as we discussed before in the previous lectures, that there is a difference between Python 2 and Python 3. We saw that integer and float divisions are a little bit different. So we'll clarify that here. And a double divided by c, a double slash c, whatever you want to call it. So this would be an integer division, right? So as you can see, once I save this and run this, I get the answer as 25.0 and 1, right? So this is where we can understand how the data types are interacting with each other, right? And one more thing that some programmers need to understand is, in Python there is nothing called an unsigned or signed numbers, right? So if you are from a C++ or a C background, you will have an understanding of the data types as in integer, as signed integer and unsigned integer. But in Python, it automatically takes the values of whichever data type that it needs. It automatically allocates the necessary amount of memory space for as big as the data gets, right? So for example, generally we use float instead of integer, because integer and float, they both preserve the float preserves the value of the decimal point also. But the main reason is why we use float sometimes is because when numbers get higher and higher, integers might lose some of the values, and float actually scales the memory space to a point where none of the data is lost, right? So that is the difference between integer and float. And this concludes all the contents that are there for this particular video, that is the numbers. And to have a quick review, let's look back at what we have seen. So in Python, there are numbers data type, that is the integer and float. Integer is just a number without any decimal point, and float is just integer with a decimal point, right? So integer and float, when they are combined individually with their own kind, for example, integer and integer will always give you an integer, and integer and float will always give you a float, and float will always give you a float, right? So, and one more exception is that integer by integer division will give you a float. Integer by, yeah, integer by integer. For example, if you want to divide, let's say, 7 by 5, right? And I will comment all this. So I get 1.4, obviously, because 5 doesn't divide 7 exactly, so I cannot get a integer and also this is a single division, right? Let's say the single division will always give me a float value, right? So, and if you want integer division, so that is double slash, right? So that is something that we need to understand. And what else have we seen? We have seen the combination of integer and float in all four operations, that is addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Subtraction we haven't seen because it's the exact same thing as the addition, right? So yeah, these are the things that you need to understand when it comes to integer and float. I hope you understood the difference, and thank you for watching the video. We'll see you in the next one.